what I want to show you in this example is how to take the basic image that was captured by the camera and make it more flattering, make it look a little bit better than what the camera probably could do on its own without necessarily super stylizing the video. So one of the ways to really understand color correction is to learn sort of the history of how waveform and vectorscopes work. These are the crazy scopes that you can bring up that in the olden days of linear editing we had pieces of equipment in our edit suites that would display this more scientific data looking images than just the color video. So if you go to the window menu and you open your Lumetri scopes, you will get something that looks like this. Now, I think this is the way it defaults, but this is not the way that I'm going to encourage you to look at it because I think it's a little more confusing to see it this way until you get more used to this. So, as with anything else in Premiere, we can generally get in and make adjustments to it by clicking on the wrench. So I'm going to go into the settings here, and we are going to change our waveform, which is what this is called. It used to be called a Waveform Monitor. And we're going to change it from RGB to a purely luminance-based waveform, meaning it's only going to look at the brightest and darkest elements and give you a much easier thing to look at. So as I switch this, you're going to see the red and green and yellow and blue and all those colors are going to be consolidated into simple black and white image. Here we go. There. Now, this can be a little easier to look at because your lines are a little more solid. The kinds of things that we're looking to control are a little easier on the eyes. All right. The other thing that we'll probably want to do is we'll want to look at the Vectorscope. Now there are two default kinds of Vectorscopes here displayed for you, and I'm going to encourage you to go to the YUV version of the Waveform Vectorscope. When you go to this version, you see sort of a color wheel, if you will, of what the image has in it, of what your video is currently parked on. So if I move around, you'll see some of these displays changing. And what it's showing you is not just brightness and darkness, that's all being displayed over here by the Waveform Monitor. The Vectorscope is showing you colors, how rich the colors are and what direction they're going. So let's start with the Waveform Monitor just because it's easier to sort of get our heads around that first. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger like that. Now we're looking at an image of somebody who's being interviewed, and as I shuttle around you can see that there is very little movement in this scene. It's just sort of her head and her mouth as she's talking, and you can tell that that is taking place right here in this part of the image. So the image is correct from left to right. So this white sort of table back here is more on the right of frame. It's a little bit brighter than, say, her shirt, so it sticks up higher here. Everything goes from the whitest, brightest elements down to the darkest elements, which would be 0. All right, so as I shuttle around and you see that that part of the screen really isn't changing much over here, then it's reflected in these lines not moving. But where her head is moving, you can definitely see it. Now, let's take it even simpler than that. Let's go to a simple white graphic. All right, so this is a 100% white, as bright as video is safe to be, white, and that is 100. If you look here, there's IRE on this side, and then they have this sort of computer units of brightness over here. So 255, if you're used to doing graphics programs, 255 is usually the whitest white you want to make. And in video, you have access to seeing it on that scale, but I'm going to tell you that the old school measurement was IRE, and that is 0 to 100. Anything over 100 is dangerous, okay? Can you create things that are over 100? Yes, you can point a camera at the sun and you can get something over 100, or you can get a reflection off a piece of glass that's over 100. It happens a lot, depending on the camera that you're using and the kind of stuff you're shooting. So our goal as editors is to make sure that nothing in our edit ever goes over 100. There are several ways for us to do that. The best way is to sort of adjust your footage as you go, shot by shot, and make sure that you account for this. And then the sort of last safety measure is to put a broadcast safe filter over the top of everything. The thing is, if you just put a broadcast safe filter across everything without making adjustments to the shots, you can really kind of muck up your footage because the broadcast safe is going to chop everything off at 100, which means there may be details up there that you're going to lose. So we don't really want to do that. So as you can see, I made this white block just as a complete screen of white and show you that it goes to 100. So the computer wants to generate things that stop at 100, or at least Premiere does. Other graphics programs can. So if I go to the next sort of box in my timeline, I have a gray box, and I literally, when I made it, said give me 50% of the luminance that is possible. So when I did 100%, it gave me 100 IRE. When I gave it 50%, it gave me 50 IRE. Again, much easier numbers to deal with than the 255. So as video people, I still say try to use the left side of the scope. All right, so that's 50%. That means that it is only half the amount of brightness that we could possibly have. And then the next one I did is black. Now here's the thing. This was created using 7% black. Your timeline, Premiere, can create things that are, again, darker than 0, blacker than black, if you will. It literally is referred to as super black, and it is a color that goes below 0. As you can see here, I just parked in between my gray background here and my black background. When I park in between, this is the black that's generated by nothing, meaning nothing is happening in the timeline right here, and so it is giving me an even 0 right here. Nothing, there's no luminance information at all, okay? Which is okay, but you generally don't want to have too many blacks that are hitting 0, because broadcast safe is basically from about 7% or 7 IRE up. Okay, so that's why I created my black background and I said give me 7% luminance, and that gave me essentially 7 IRE. So it's just a little below the 10 IRE mark here. So can I go below that with a couple little peaks and peaks, or I should say valleys, because right, they're below, so they'd be valleys, not peaks. Yes, you can occasionally get away with it. What you don't want is really much of anything going under 0, and it can happen, so we got to watch for that. But I wanted you to see that back in the day, we had to be very careful to not go below -7. In this sort of digital age, you have a little more latitude, but going below 0 can definitely create problems and anomalies when you're rendering, and it might actually hurt your video if it ever does get broadcast. Let's hope it does sometime. All right, so I wanted you to be able to compare. We saw the white, but what happens when we stack these things? All right, well, what I have right here is I have stacked a white box, a gray box, and my 7% black box. And then, of course, wherever there isn't anything, that's 0%. So when we look at it on the scope, we see, yes, there's a good amount of 0 pretty much across the whole screen from left to right. So even though it's like all here and then it isn't here, it's down here, it just sees the measurement of it is across the whole screen. So yes, there is a plateau, if you will, of 0 luminance in here. There is a 7% one. Notice it's to the right of the frame, just like it is over here, but I intentionally put it up here so that you could see that just because it's up high in the screen, it's not going to be high over here. It has to do with its brightness, so it's down here. The middle one is in the middle, and then the white box, which is at 100, is, even though it's low in the screen over here, it's going to show up high in the screen over here in the scope. Okay, so left to right matters very much. So you've probably seen this before. Well, here's the reason why we use this. This is a chart that is generated to basically give you perfect representations of all the different colors and brightness levels so that you can calibrate your equipment. So back in the day when I was making lots of commercials for TV stations, we'd have to master them off onto a tape, and that tape would get mailed out, duplicated and mailed out to all these different ad agencies and TV stations all over the country. All right, and then they would pop the tape in on their machine, and they would calibrate their machine to make the whites the way that my timeline is expecting whites to be, blacks where the timeline is expected to be, colors. It basically gave the user on the other end a way to set their deck to match exactly what my deck was set for when I mastered it. So they'd lay bars and tone, which is what this is, color bars, on the front of the tape, and that would allow them to sort of calibrate everything to match. And they're still occasionally used for stuff. It's still a good test. But this is what it looks like on a waveform monitor. You've got 100 just being hit one time. So even though you look at this with your eye and you say, well, I see white here, and I see white here, and I see white here, this is the only white that's actually hitting 100. This one is this one, and this one over here is this one. So those are actually at about 75% or 75 IRE, and then it steps down, right? So then you see this stair stepping going down, and that's because these are different colors, and each of these colors has a luminance quality to it. Even though the hue or type of color it is changes, it has a stair-step effect as to how bright they are.
Now, in my example, I've left the clamp signal on, which is actually showing us sort of a false representation of what's going on here. Anything that goes too high or too low, it visually won't show it. So I advise that you turn this off, even though I'm going to end up with it on for the rest of this demo. Now, when I turned it off, you'll notice that something went below 0. That is a little bit of black. There's actually 3 bars of black right here. There's a higher than 0, a 0, which is the same as the background here, and then there's a bar right here that is actually super black, and it goes below that. So normally you'll want to keep signal clamping off so that you can see anything that goes too high or low and tell whether there's texture there worth salvaging. But you can work with it on. I just wanted you to see that you're literally not going to see anything go too high or too low with clamp signal on.
All right, so this is a good time to segue back then. What if we look at the thing that's designed to show us color? So let's go to the Vectorscope YUV, and I can put it up at the same time, and as you can see, there are these little dots. Maybe I'll turn off the Waveform Monitor so you can see it bigger. So we have these dots. These are the purest versions of magenta, red, yellow, green, cyan, and blue. Inside there are another set of squares that represent each of those colors. And notice that this chart gives us a perfect dot in the middle of each of these calibration points. If it was set wrong, if this file was messed up and the color had drifted, then these would be in the wrong place and you'd immediately know something is wrong.
You'll notice these little crosshairs are coming in at strange angles. This line right here is considered the flesh tone line. Okay, and that doesn't matter if your subject is African American, Finnish, German, doesn't matter skin tone, color as we see it with our eyes. What is true about all skin is that the blood underneath is what actually makes the skin tone appear to be somewhere between yellow and red, and it's right along this line. So as you're correcting for a face, as we would be with this face, we should want to put as much along this line as there is skin on the scene. So basically you want to look for the skin pattern and put it so that it goes on this line, and it will give you a much more proper representation of what flesh tone should look like.
They have created sort of a safe zone within this little interconnected web. So when you're making color adjustments, if you go too far outside of these connected dots, which won't be here if I show you regular footage. See, if I jump to footage, now you have to make sense of what you're looking at, which in this case is a blob of different colors, and everything is sort of drifting. So whatever's red or orange in this scene is almost too saturated. It's getting close to dangerous. If you go outside this little web, you can start having problems again with your files because it's too rich of a color to be safely transmitted. All right. So again, as things move, there's not a lot of color changing in this scene, so you see a little bit of texture dancing around down there, but for the most part, it's pretty bland. Now the other thing we notice, I've deliberately used a scene that is not color balanced very well. This whole thing is skewing in the direction of sort of an orange, almost a green, yellow color. So we're going to fix that. And I can tell without even looking at this, but having stared at these for years, I can tell by looking at it, there's a lot of yellow and orange in here because you can see that this little blob of visuals is headed off between yellow and orange. So it's giving me a sense that things aren't quite right. If the scene is perfectly white, everything would be in the middle. Okay, so you're rarely going to shoot anything that's only white, but here is that white background, and notice there are no colors anywhere else. It is purely white. Now what's also interesting is if this is a correct gray, meaning there's no tint to it, it too will be dead center, even though it's very different looking, right? We go from white to gray, it looks very different, but on our scope it's no different because it has not strayed in any direction of any color that we don't want in the scene. And the same will be true of black. If I jump down to black, it doesn't move. So anything that has a color tint to it is going to create drift or pattern that goes away from center. But whether it's perfectly centered here, if it's perfectly centered here, it's either perfectly black or perfectly white or perfectly gray. All right, so what does that look like with footage? Well, again, I look at this shot of her and I say, yikes, everything is clearly kind of off. This stuff should probably feel more like it's in the middle. So how do we fix it? Well, the easiest way to fix it that Adobe's provided for us is the ability to just grab the little eyedropper, find something that's supposed to be white in the scene, and it will make an adjustment. All right, so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to go and notice as I move around, it's trying to white balance this for me as I move it around. And you can see it on the scope that it's kind of moving and jiggling, and that depending on where I go, it's going to try to move as much back to center as it possibly can. That's pretty good right there. So what did it look like before? Well, let's turn off our effect. There it is before, here it is after. Notice the little dance that it's doing here on the scope. Before, after, before, after. Much better. Now, I can do this manually as well. When you use the eyedropper, it's basically pulling or pushing towards blue or yellow. In this case, it was too yellow, so it pulled away from yellow and went more blue. And then it was a little too close to green, so it pulled away from the green and it moved it over to pink. This to me is a little harder for me to work with because I'm having to sort of think about just pulling and pushing one of two directions, when the reality is I have a whole bunch of different colors I want to push and pull towards. So even though most of it can be corrected with this, the old school tools were a little more elaborate, and they are here as well. So if you go into the Lumetri panel, and I'm going to go to the color wheels and match section. So these color wheels match the same layout as the Waveform Vectorscope. So if I look at this scene and I say, well, there's some pretty rich material right here because I can tell it's a little brighter right there. That means there's a whole lot of stuff that's qualifying for that area. There's very few things that are qualifying out here, so it's a little more ghosted. I can pull the stuff that's here towards blue, which is where it looks like it wants to go. I can do that on the midtones, the highlights, or the shadows. Midtones cover the most range, so I usually start with that unless I'm pretty confident that I don't want to be that aggressive. But in this case, we have a good amount of sort of lit up stuff here that I bet is either the black or could be the whites in this. But it's a whole lot of stuff that's not in the center like I want it to be. So I'm going to pull the midtones in the same direction as the scope. So as I look at my scope, you'll see it move. See, and if I go drastically too far to blue, not only can you see it on the scope, but you can see that the shot is going really, really blue. All right, so that's too far. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to put as much of that bright spot in the center as I can. And that's pretty good. All right, so that's the midtones. I might do the same with the highlights. All right, let's see what moves when I start moving that. I might just dial it around just to see what moves on my scope. And I can say, let's go closer here to center, and that gives me a more neutral color. And the same with my shadows. Your blacks can actually be off as well. And that honestly is a little more subtle, but when it's wrong, you know it. All right, so there is everything. Here it is before I did anything to it, and here it is now. And just look at how much stuff is adrift here and watch it jump over. Boom, now most of the stuff is here. Now, do we have some blue? Yeah, she's got a blue shirt on. I expect to see that. Do we have some red? Yep, I can see the orange, red sort of stuff up here. I expect that to be there. But this core center, I was able to move, and I was able to make it look much, much better. Now, the next thing I may need to do is contrast, all right? So I'm going to go back. I'm going to turn on the waveform again, because now we're worried about what's bright and dark, okay? So if I don't, I can leave these both up, but I'm going to make it bigger for you just so that you can see what I'm doing, okay? So I'm going to turn off the Vectorscope here. And there we can see all our luminance. Now, do I have anything hitting 0? No. I've got a couple things just probably in the neighborhood of -7, but I think it could be better. So I'm actually going to go to the tone controls that I have here in Lumetri Color. So exposure is really a very strong adjustment. I wouldn't use it unless you really know this whole scene is just too dark or maybe too light, because it's going to try to adjust a lot more of what happens in the camera when you change exposure. I'm more of a fan of having an individual slider for regions within the image that I can control. Okay, so what I mean by that is exposure tends to be a very drastic thing. Contrast, the definition of contrast is darker darks, lighter lights. So you're literally saying, while you slide that left and right, you're saying pull the lights and darks away from each other more, which is technically two parts of the image that are moving with one slider. And I don't like giving up that much control. What I can do is say, oh, the very peaks, the very tip-top whites, the very top of these, those can be adjusted fairly independently. Now there are better color correction programs in the world than Premiere and even Avid and Final Cut that can really get in and be very meticulous about it. So these adjustments are not pure, but they're better if you break them into their subcategories. So I'm going to do the tip-top whites, and I'm going to pull it up. I think the room could stand to be a little brighter. Not too bad. And then I can do the same with the blacks. Well, we don't have a lot of blacks in here. Her shirt's kind of dark. We have some shadows around her face that probably ought to be black. And that's what these little things are down here. Let's see if we pull them closer to 0, if we like the look of that better. All right, you'll notice they start to sort of nosedive. And it's kind of weird that it does that, but you have to sort of keep an eye on whether you're losing detail. So you notice that when it's crashing against the 0, everything's getting mashed down here. It's called crushing your blacks, and when you do that, you lose detail. So I can't really see the texture of her shirt anymore. I'm losing the texture in her hair where it was dark. Now I literally can't see the texture anymore. So I've gone too far. So whether it's taking the whites too high or the darks too low, you don't want to crush your elements because you will lose the natural texture. All right, so I might allow it on a couple of little areas in her hair, but for the most part, I don't want to go that far. So supposedly we were just adjusting just a small portion of the lower part and the small portion of the upper part. So what if I want to adjust things more in the middle? Well, they call those highlights, which is going to be from about 80 to about 50, and shadows, which is going to be about 40 to about 20. Okay, so things that aren't completely black but are a little darker. It's going to create more contrast if I pull these numbers apart from one another. So let's try the shadows. Since we were just messing with the blacks and we pulled them down a little bit, what happens if I pull these down? Well, notice it's not really creating any more crushing down there because it's not moving that part of the screen or the image. It's just moving the sort of darker areas. All right, so that's not too bad. Now I can go to highlights because it all got a little too dark. I can go to highlights and I can pull them back up, which again should be moving a little bit independently of the whites. The whites should be mostly the top, but again, it does the best it can. This is all composite video, and there's not much. You can't be that much more controlled than what you're seeing. Now the other thing is, there's nothing wrong with your eyeballs. What do I mean by that? I can look at this and I still think she looks a little yellow. So what I could do is say I want to tint this just a little towards pink, just to give her a little more of a flesh tone. So I might drag it just a smidge over. But if I go too far, the whites are going to start feeling pink, right? And that's not really what I want, but I just wanted to give her skin tones just a little more. So if I turn these both back on so you can see them again, now I can see both. I could say, well, these again are too aggressive. I want to go back to the color wheels. Skin tones tend to land in the mid-tones, so maybe I just need to take it not just towards blue, but a little towards pink. And that's going to give us just a little bit better skin tone on her than what we had with our general mix. Now it's starting to feel a little more correct. And of course her skin is reasonable. She's well lit, so it's reasonably light. I might actually go into the highlights and do the same thing and pull them just a little towards pink just to give her a little flesh tone. But again, here we can turn the effect on and off. Which do you like better, that or that? Pretty big difference, right? So in my example, I basically did what we just saw, which was just basically fixing for white. And then I added an element of relighting to the scene. And this is sort of what I'm talking about. So if you look, this is a very blank sort of world. There's not a lot of shadow light play in here. And yet we have light sources in the shot. We have candles. This is an opportunity for us. So I went in and I did this to it. All right, and I'm going to show you how this can make a world of difference in your piece. All right, and I actually like the color correction we just did a little better than the color correction I did on this one, shy of the lighting effect we're going to do. So how do we do these color effects? Well, I'm going to show you. And I'm going to take this image and I'm going to make it a little smaller so I can actually draw outside of it. So if I set it for 10, it's super small. If I set it for 50, it's too big. Your number will be different than mine, probably because our screen resolutions are different. This one I'm setting to 25. That gave me a little bit of a margin to play with. So first thing I want to do is I want to create more darkness. Shadows are actually your friend. We want to create some darkness back here. We want to create some darkness across your chest, just a little bit around here, and then maybe a little bit up in the corner because we want to eventually bring out these lights. So I like shadow lines. I like feeling like there's a shadow being cast either from the fact that the light's coming in a window frame or there's something sort of blocking the image. So up here we can see there's the beginning of darkness. We're going to make it better. So before I start clicking and drawing, I'm going to want to add a mask to another event or another occurrence of the Lumetri color. So when I started making adjustments to her the first time, it went ahead and added the Lumetri color effect and then started applying it. So in a sense, this was our white balance. So if I click on this, I should be able to rename it and call that correction. And then I can collapse it so it's not as big of a list, right? So now I'm going to go get the Lumetri color again. So I'm going to go L-U-M-E, Lumetri, and I'm going to go get the Lumetri color and I'm going to add it to this shot again. So there's nothing happening with this Lumetri effect yet, but I'm going to actually create a mask with it. So I'm going to click on the pen tool here so that it knows I'm making a mask on this shot. Okay, so I scaled it down, you can see there, and I'm going to start drawing. I'm going to draw outside of this, and I'm going to draw around where I think the shadows could go. I'm going to go up and across her chest just a little bit, just to downplay that. I'm going to come up over here and create kind of a shade across that corner, and then I'm going to reconnect. Alright, so that is my path. So if I take the exposure down, it's trying to basically darken everything inside that, and that's the opposite of what I want. What I want is to invert it. So if I go over to my mask, you'll see there is an invert option, and when I click that, it gives me more what I want. Now, of course, the lines I drew are way too sharp, so the next thing we're going to mess with is feathering. So I'm going to feather those bad boys out and make it a little softer and a little more organic looking. And if I want to, I can move some of these points around if I don't like where they sort of fell. You know, I was guessing when I did it, so if I want to make it more exact, then I can do that. Maybe I go up like this so that our necklace still sort of shows. I don't want to hit this because this looks like it's naturally lit. And then we have this down here. And again, I can make that shadow as far across as I want. Now, as long as I'm on the mask, it keeps my stupid blue line there and it's harder to see. So if I go back up and click on Lumetri color, I can look at it and go, ooh, that's pretty good. Notice how the shadows made it far more interesting. Now, have I gone to extreme? Yeah, probably. I think feathering is more the problem though. So I'm going to go and I'm going to feather it some more. And the more I feather it, the more subtle it becomes. All right, and if I'm still not happy, of course, I can click back on the path and I can say, well, let's move this one up so it's not as obvious, and maybe the same with this one. We'll let it come in from the side a little more naturally. And maybe her chest is a little much. Maybe we'll just do it across her arms. But the point is, finesse it, make it look the way you want, and when you're done, you end up with something that is far more interesting. So here it is, no shadows. Here it is with shadows. To me, it's already more interesting. Now, we're going to do that again, but we're actually going to relight her face. Not that her face is too dark, but we want the face to pop, right? The eyes are the window of the soul. So I'm going to right click on this panel and I'm going to rename it or add to the name Shadows so that I don't lose track, because you will lose track of these things. And I'm going to go get another Lumetri color effect. I'm going to drop it on here and I'm going to do the pen tool, right? That is there built into the mask, and I'm going to draw literally a mask for her face. All right, and when I reconnect it, it closes, and I can say, all right, let's take the brightness of her face, let's turn it up just a little bit, and of course the feathering will make it look more natural. And I might need to change the shape once you feather it because it gets too feathered in the wrong direction. You know, I want her mouth to show up too, so her chin and everything. Now here's what's cool, right? So we're on her. However, I want this to motion track because her head's going to move around, right? So actually, even though I've already drawn it, the smartest thing for me to do is to go back to the very first frame of her shot, which I'm going to zoom in, go down here, go to her very first frame, and I'm going to put this where I think it belongs for the first frame, and then it's going to motion track from that point forward. All right, so I'm going to say that's pretty good. All right, and then these little buttons here are the mask path. So if you tell it to play, basically, it will start making keyframes and try to follow along whatever it thinks you've masked to, in this case, her face. So let's see how it does. So you sit and you watch it, and it chugs through the clip, and it sets a keyframe every frame to try to keep that shape, the mask you made, positioned over what it thinks is the element you're trying to track with. So if she turned her head and flipped her hair, I'd be in trouble because it would probably get confused once her head turned that much. But in this situation, it's probably okay. She's not going to move too much. Now, if they move too much, you may have to go in and do these keyframes by hand, and it takes a lot longer, as you can imagine, to do by hand. So there are times where I'll just go, we're going to cut away there. I'm not going to mess with it. It's too complicated. All right, so now there is our interview. I'm going to zoom out a smidge, and we're going to play it, and we're going to see if it did a good job. All right, so from the beginning, looks like it's staying with her. If I stop it, you'll see it again. Stop it. It's doing a good job. It's just much more striking to look at someone, her eyes are popping now in ways they weren't before, and it's because we've lit up her whole face. Let's talk about those candles. So if we can light her face, we can light those candles, or at least the wall behind them, so that it appears they give off more light than they actually do. So we like this color effect we just did. I'm going to right click it, rename it, and call it face so I don't forget. And then I'm going to go get another Lumetri color, and I'm going to add it to this as well. And I'm going to get the old pen tool out because I'm going to create a mask, and I'm grabbing the pen tool right here so that it knows to make a mask with it. And I'm just going to say, okay, where would the light radiate from something like this? Well, it would probably radiate across the wall, kind of like that. So I'm going to turn it up, and I'm going to feather it. And I might even take like the highlights up a little bit more so it has even more kick to it. Let's click off and see if we like it. That's pretty good. A nice little gradient on it. And of course, if it's still not enough, I can turn it up more. Now the problem is, of course, you lose some contrast when you do that. So if I pull it up and I really do want it to be like this bright, I would probably also then go into the shadows and I'd pull them down. That way I've got a little darkness in there. And if you don't believe me, look at the scopes. If I pull the shadows up and down, see there's stuff moving inside the luminance information here. See it moving? It's very subtle, but that confirms that I'm good. And if this was really dark, I could confirm that I'm not going too dark and creating a problem for myself. So that looks pretty nice. I could also tint it, right? Because all these controls apply only to what's going on here. So maybe it wouldn't be as white light because it's coming from a candle. Maybe I'll take the temperature of it and I'll slant just a smidge towards orange, and now it's even warmer. And maybe I've gone a little too far. I will tell you this, less is almost always more. When I do these kinds of things, I go too far really easily, and then I pull back on it. So, but that's pretty good. Again, what would it look like had we done nothing before we messed with it and after we messed with it? Now, there are skin smoothing plugins that we can use that would actually smooth her skin texture out even more. Those cost money. I haven't found anything built in or that's free that's worth it, but there's one called Cosmo that's made by Red Giant that's pretty awesome. It does a great job of taking skin and making it look smoother. And even though, of course, I'm more inclined to use it on women, I'll use it on men too. I'll just make it not quite as strong. It doesn't get rid of stubble or anything that I wouldn't want to lose, but you do tend to lose some of the discoloration of the skin. So, yeah, the Cosmo plugin, fantastic one to add to your bag of tricks, but there are others out there as well. Now, I want to show you one more quick example just because repetition is good, and it's another sort of scenario from the same interview, right? So if I make her look this good, what happens when I cut to the other angle? Yikes, right? Nowhere near. They look like they're on a different planet. So that's a problem. So I'm going to go through the process again. I'm going to do it fairly quickly, and you just kind of watch me do it again for repetition's sake. So as soon as I look at this, I go, yep, it needs more white balance. So I'm going to go in and find something white. The floor looks pretty good. Let's see what that looks like. Now I have a frame of reference, so I have to look and say, does it look okay compared to this world? Well, we were too yellow. Now we're too blue. So maybe I'll do another sample. Let's try something else that's white. There, I clicked and held it, and it gave me the ability to drag around a little bit, which sometimes is a little better. All right, that's not too bad. Now again, I can go into the color wheels, which I think I will do, because again, these are pretty aggressive adjustments, although you can already tell the blue is pretty pinned. So maybe we'll back off on the blue here. That looks better already. Now what would that look like on my scopes? All right, so here I'll undo it. So when I look at this, I can already see there's stuff not hitting dead center, and there's a lot going towards blue. Now we have quite a few blues in here, so I'm going to expect to see some of that, but there's more in the blue direction than I want. So as I drag this back, there we go. So it was all the way over here. So as I drag the blue back, you can see it sort of bend back into warmer colors. See if I go too far, but you see it on the scope. The scopes will protect you from going too far. All right, that's already a little bit better. Maybe a little warmer. Yeah, we've taken her pretty far. So the reality is I may have to do the same thing here. So how did I make her skin so much warmer? Well, I went out of the basic correction area and I went into the color wheels and I went to the midtones and I said, let's go towards warmer colors. So I'm going towards sort of a pink or an orange. It's already much better. Some of this could just be lighting at this point because this is much darker and her face is darker. So we sort of have to judge by what is the object that appears in both shots, which is her face. And her face is more yellow over here. So I might actually go back before I get too carried away, and I might actually change the first shot to be not quite as extreme. But the point is, you gotta keep using your eyes and trusting and knowing the process you did so that you can replicate it as much as possible on the second angle. So as much as there are some natural shadows in here, I still think that it's part of what's making this scene so distracting. So I'm going to go back though before we put the shadows in. I'm going to brighten things up a little. So I'm going to go into the exposure. Now if you'll notice, the floor texture is the first thing to get crushed as I start bringing up the exposure. And as I said, exposure is very powerful. It will blow out textures of everything if you're not careful. So I don't usually go there unless it's just a nudge. Another reason to really care about that, there's probably no avoiding it. At some point you're going to have to edit a wedding, and you think about it, you know, a wedding dress is $2,000-$3,000 worth of white material that has lace and texture to it, and if you shoot and edit a video of a bride and you can't see the texture in the wedding dress, you're in trouble. So knowing how to protect from crushing the whites is very, very important. It will matter to you one day, I promise. So I'm going to pull the whites down, but I'm going to take the highlights up. So I'm trying not to crush the texture that happens in the brightest areas, and I still need the scene to be a little lighter. So I'm going to just split the difference back and forth between whites and highlights. Now there's not much contrast here either, so I'm going to start with the blacks. I'm going to pull them down a little bit. It's not too bad. Maybe now I'll go with the shadows, so I'm getting things that are not quite black but a little darker. All right, so let's do our mask. Right, so I'm going to go into the effects controls. I'm going to rename this the correction. All right, that basically got our colors right. I'm going to collapse it so I don't have to look at all those controls. I'm going to grab another one, drag it in here. We'll name it in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and use the free draw pen here under mask, and then I'm going to create some shadows. All right, so especially when you work for a lot of women, they're very sensitive about how their back looks on camera. The other thing is this whole like pillows in front of them thing can be kind of distracting. So I'm actually going to deliberately sort of shadowize their whole lap. Now these areas back here are clearly next to a light source. So even though I could shadow them, the reality is it's not going to look right. People can tell when you've adjusted something that normally would be like a light source or a wall that's being hit with direct light. So I tend to not do that. So I'm going to take the exposure down just so I can see what I did. And as you can see, it's darkening everything on the inside. So once again, I probably need to invert it. There we go. I'm going to feather it a bit. Not too bad. Maybe we'll even go a little bit down more. It doesn't have to be, you're never going to make everything disappear, and if you did, it would look really too fakey. But it's amazing how just taking some of the light off something like her back will keep the audience's eyes from really dwelling on that area. So it's often about just redirecting a little as opposed to completely hiding. Could you hide stuff? Yes, I could hide stuff using this technique. I can blur stuff that I don't want to see. I could take out license plates that I don't want in my B-roll to show up. You know, I can do all kinds of stuff. But the reality is, the more you do, the chances are the more your audience is going to feel like something fishy going on. All right, so here I am. Here it is, off, on. It's just enough to not point people's eyes down, but rather stay on their faces. And that's pretty good. So shall we relight her face? I think that's a good idea, our host. So I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to rename it and call them shadows. All right, and then we'll grab one more Lumetri color. Again, I can drag it up here, I can drag it right here. It doesn't really matter, these are the same things. Grab the pen, let's find that her face. If it's ever too small, the area you're trying to do, remember you can scale up. So even fit took it up a little bit bigger because I had it set small on purpose. All right, I'm on the first keyframe. Now let's say, what if I'm not on the first keyframe? What if you forget and you get it all perfectly here? Well, you can do 2 passes. And what I mean by that is you can say go from here forward and then go from here backwards. So I'm going to show you how to do that. All right, and I keep messing up her face here. All right, so let's say I like that. I can say, okay, I need the mask path to go from here forward. And it will analyze and stick with her face from that point forward. And then we'll be able to see the keyframes. I didn't show them to you the first time, but you're going to be able to see them. This is a whole bunch of keyframes really close to one another here. And it shows that it's tracking with her. But what about from the beginning to that point? Well, if I go to the keyframes, and I go just to the left of them, I could say jump to the first keyframe that's here, and then I can say run in reverse, and it will actually play in reverse and motion track that way as well. So you have either direction you could go. All right, and then it filled in the gap. So now the entire clip has keyframes on every frame for her face position for that light. And of course, I didn't make an adjustment yet, but what's nice is even after I've got it tracked, I can now go to and make the adjustment. And as long as I'm not having to keyframe these adjustments, which I'm not, I want it to be universally applied wherever her face is, you know, I don't have to re-motion track. It's going to stay with it. And if I notice the next day, oh, I went too far, it's too hot, I can still go in and back off on it if I need to because the tracking's already built in. All right. And of course, you have your scopes that you can double check and make sure. We've got some colors that are getting a little outside. You know, they can get out here a little bit. It's not the end of the world, but when it gets out here, it starts to be a little dangerous. So, and we've got some points at the top that are getting close to 100. So, I mentioned a limiter. There is a limiter built in that you can use. I'm going to type down in the effects window limit, and you'll notice there's an audio limiter and a video limiter. I want to use the legacy video limiter. Okay, I'm going to throw it on this scene. I'm going to throw it on the other one too, and show you kind of what we do. So if I go back to this one and I hit the letter V to get back to an arrow and I go to the effects controls, there is a limiter that has been added to this clip, okay? And it has some presets which aren't bad, but I have found it safer to change a couple of these things. So what I do is I take the smart limit and I say no, I want separate color and luminance, chroma and luma controls. And then I say I don't think anything should go over let's say 96% or 96 IRE, right? That keeps us carefully away from 100. And my chroma, it thinks 130 safe. I'm going to tell you 125 is safer. All right, so that will do it and that will protect you. And now, no matter what I adjust down here, it will never let anything go over 96, and it'll never let the colors go too far outside of where they're allowed. Now here's the thing, if you're doing a whole lot of color correction, which I normally do, I don't actually put it on the clip. What do? Well, I'm going to show you. So if I want to, I'm going to take off that limiter. I just went to the effect and deleted it. Okay, I'm going to do the same to this one, and I'm going to show you how to use an adjustment layer. All right, so we're going to generate an adjustment layer. So before you go to the file menu, you've got to click somewhere down in your project or in a bin because it's going to generate media. It needs to know where you want it. And I'm okay with it being loose in this case. So I want a new adjustment layer. All right, it says your sequence is running at this frame rate at this size. Is that the kind of clip you want to generate? Yes. So I hit OK, and here's my adjustment layer. So this layer is basically empty. But what it does is it allows you to apply an effect over the top of everything that you're doing, and everything underneath gets the same effect applied to it. So it's easy to think, oh, I'll do all my color correction up here and it'll fix everything underneath. No, every camera angle is different. Sometimes takes are different. The sun shifts, that goes behind a cloud during one answer. I still encourage you to do your correction clip by clip by clip. However, something like a limiter, you can absolutely put it over the top of the whole thing. Again, there's nothing here. If I turn it on and off, nothing changes. But that's because I have nothing going on inside of it. So I'm going to go get that limiter and I'm going to put it in the adjustment layer. And now I have the same controls that I did before, but I actually can apply it to every clip underneath here. All right, so I'll go in, and to show you the settings again, I don't trust Smart Limit. I want Chroma and Luma, independent numbers I have control over, and the Luma Max 95, 96, I tend to use 96, is pretty good. And then the Color Max, if it thinks 130 is fine, I'm going to tell you 125 is even safer. So let's do that and hit return. Now everything underneath this is getting affected. And what's cool is if you put your adjustment layer on while you're doing all your color correction, you can actually see what it's really going to look like, because if you are overdriving something and the limiter is going to clip it off, you'll know it before it's too late. I have had situations where I color corrected everything, thought I accounted for everything, threw this limiter on last, watched it, and all of a sudden all the white texture went out of something. And I'm like, I should have had the layer on when I was fine-tuning that. You know what I mean? Because it's basically saying, this is what it's going to do to it. It's going to chop off whatever's going higher. So better that you see it while you're working on it and try to correct for it than to just have it chop it off, and then you have no detail in any of that, whether it's the blacks or the blacks at the bottom or the peaks at the top. Either way, that's a bigger risk. All right, and that is how you can enhance the look of an interview or of a shot, any shot really, using masks and creating the illusion of lighting that there probably wasn't time or equipment available for doing. And you can even motion track those things on if it's something that has to move, like a face.